The cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain that fills most of the cranial cavity. Each cerebral hemisphere consists of an outer layer of gray matter called cerebral cortex, an inner mass of white matter, large masses of gray matter embedded in the basal part of the white matter, which is called as basal ganglia or basal nuclei, and also a cavity within it which is called lateral ventricle. In this video, we will specifically see the sulci and gyri present on the surface of the cerebral hemisphere. When you look at the external features of the cerebral hemisphere, that include different poles, surfaces, borders, sulci and gyri. First, we will look at the different poles of the cerebral hemisphere. Each cerebral hemisphere presents three poles: frontal, occipital and temporal. The anterior end of the hemisphere, which is located over here, this is the frontal pole, and posterior end over here, this is the occipital pole, and the temporal pole is below and in front at the junction of orbital and tentorial surfaces. We can see the temporal pole in this particular region. Now we can look at the surfaces. There are mainly three surfaces for the cerebral hemisphere. The first surface is the surface that we are visualizing over here. This area, this entire surface. This surface is known as superolateral surface. It is mostly convex and most extensive one. It faces upwards and laterally and conforms to the corresponding half of the cranial vault. The next surface is here. We can identify the surface over here. This entire area is known as the medial surface. I will write it over here. The medial surface is flat and vertical. It presents a thick C-shaped cut surface of this particular view over here. This is the corpus callosum. Lastly, we can identify the inferior surface. Inferior surface, it is irregular to adapt to the floors of anterior and middle cranial fossae. This is the inferior surface. It is divided into two parts by a deep horizontal groove or sulcus, which is located over here. The sulcus present in its depth. It is known as the stem of lateral sulcus. And this stem of lateral sulcus divides the inferior surface into an anterior part and a posterior part. Anterior part is known as orbital surface and posterior part is known as tentorial surface. We will see some more details of this arrangement. These surfaces are separated from each other by different borders. There are mainly three borders: the supromedial border, inferolateral border, and the infromedial border. The infromedial border is divided into an anterior part which is known as medial orbital border and a posterior part which is known as medial occipital border. The orbital part of the inferolateral border is called the superciliary border. Basically, the superolateral surface is separated from the medial surface by supromedial border. Superolateral surface is separated from the inferior surface by inferolateral border. The medial surface is separated from the inferior surface by infromedial border. Now we will move on to see the main topic of concern for this video, that is the sulci and gyri. The cerebral cortex is highly extensive in man. To accommodate it in the limited space available within the rigid cranial cavity, the surface of cerebral hemisphere becomes folded, producing numerous convolutions separated by fissures. These convolutions and fissures are termed gyri and sulci respectively. In human brain, the total surface area of cerebral hemisphere is about 2000 centimeters square, but approximately two-thirds of this is hidden from the surface view within the walls of the sulci. A brain with the convoluted cerebral cortex is termed gyrencephalic, while the one with smooth cortex is called lissencephalic. The sulci vary in depth from slight grooves to deep fissures, and some of them are sufficiently deep to indent the wall of the lateral ventricle in the depth of hemisphere. The gyri consist of a central core of white matter covered by a layer of grey matter, the cerebral cortex. There is a great deal of individual variations in the details of sulci and gyri. So we will see the sulci and gyri present on each individual surfaces of the cerebral hemisphere. We will start with the sulci and gyri of supralateral surface of cerebral hemisphere. We will draw along the video. We can draw along with it so that by the end of the video you will be having a clear idea about how to represent the sulci and gyri of each surfaces diagrammatically. First, you can show the outline of the cerebral hemisphere, supralateral surface of cerebral hemisphere. It is marked by prominent areas. I will come to that after 2 slides. A prominent sulci is present in this particular view, and this sulci is known as the lateral sulcus. Specifically, this is the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. This lateral sulcus, it is also known as lateral sulcus of Sylvius. It is the most conspicuous of all cerebral sulci, and it has a stem and 3 rami. We will come to the details of the sulcus later. This stem of the sulcus begins as a deep cleft on the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere and extends laterally between the temporal pole and the posterior part of orbital surface of the hemisphere. We will see the stem of the lateral sulcus in detail in the inferior surface of cerebrum. And on reaching the supralateral surface of cerebral hemisphere, that is at this particular point is known as the Sylvian point. And on reaching this point, this lateral sulcus will be dividing into 3 rami: anterior horizontal, anterior ascending, and posterior. And among them, we have already identified the posterior ramus. The posterior ramus, which is visualized over here, it is the main part of the sulcus. It is about 7.5 centimeter long, and it runs posteriorly, as the name suggests. It runs posteriorly across the lateral surface and ends in the inferior parietal lobule by an upturned posterior end. This is the upturned posterior end of lateral sulcus. Now we will come to see the next prominent sulcus, that is the central sulcus. This is it. It is also known as the central sulcus of Rolando. It begins by cutting the supromedial border of the hemisphere, that is this particular point, 1 centimeter behind the midpoint between frontal and occipital poles. That is, this is the frontal pole, this is the occipital pole, and the midpoint will roughly come around this particular area. The central sulcus cuts the supromedial border of the cerebral hemisphere 1 centimeter behind it. It runs sinuously downwards and forwards at an angle of 70 degree and ends just above the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. Usually, this sulcus will not touch the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. The upper end of this particular central sulcus usually extends into the medial surface. This central sulcus forms the boundary between the motor area of the cerebral hemisphere in the front and sensory area behind. To discuss further about sulci and gyri and other aspects of the cerebral hemisphere, the superolateral surface of the hemisphere is arbitrarily divided into four lobes mainly from the surface: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe, and we are dividing it into these four lobes with the help of mainly three sulci, that is the central, lateral, and parieto-occipital sulcus, and two imaginary lines. So before coming into that, we have to identify an area just in front of the occipital pole, and this is that area. It is known as the pre-occipital notch. Now we can see the parieto-occipital sulcus, which is a main sulcus on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It may extend slightly onto the superolateral surface. We can see that extent of parieto-occipital sulcus over here. Now we have to draw two imaginary lines. The first imaginary line, it is a vertical line joining the parieto-occipital sulcus to the pre-occipital notch. You can see the line over here. And the second line is a backward continuation of the horizontal part of posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus till it joins the first line. That is, the posteriormost end of the lateral sulcus is upturned. We are not drawing a line from there. We will draw a line from this particular point. This is that line. Now we have drawn the two imaginary lines. With this arrangement, we can now clearly identify the four lobes on the surface of superolateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Anterior to the central sulcus and above the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, here we have the frontal lobe. Posterior to the central sulcus and in front of the upper part of first imaginary line, we have the parietal lobe. Below it is bounded by the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus and the second imaginary line. We can clearly identify that from the figure. Below the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus and the second imaginary line, we have temporal lobe. It is separated from the occipital lobe by the lower part of first imaginary line. Finally, behind the vertical line joining the parieto-occipital sulcus and pre-occipital notch, we have the occipital lobe. In addition to these lobes, we have two more lobes in the cerebral hemisphere, that is the insula or island of Rayleigh and the limbic lobe, but that is not visualized from the surface. Now we can see further details regarding the sulci and gyri, other sulci and gyri on the superolateral surface of cerebral hemisphere. For better understanding, we will divide the sulci and gyri into different lobes. First, we will see the sulci and gyri in frontal lobe. Then we will identify the temporal lobe, sulci and gyri, so on. First, the frontal lobe, sulci and gyri. This is the first sulcus that we are going to deal. It is known as precentral sulcus. As you can see, it is often broken into two or three parts. It runs downwards and forwards parallel and little anterior to the central sulcus. The area between the central and precentral sulcus is known as precentral gyrus, and this is the area of precentral gyrus. Anterior to the precentral sulcus, there are two sulci called the superior frontal sulcus and inferior frontal sulcus, and they run horizontally. These sulci divide the region of the frontal lobe in front of precentral sulcus into three. This is 1, 2, and 3. These are known as superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. Now we can see the details of the lateral sulcus which are present on this particular surface. We have already identified the detailing of posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. Now we will identify the rest of the rami of the lateral sulcus. They are anterior horizontal ramus over here and the anterior ascending ramus which is shown over this particular area. The anterior horizontal ramus, this particular ramus, it is about 2.5 centimeter long and passes forwards into the inferior frontal gyrus. The anterior ascending ramus, the second one, it runs upwards for about 2.5 centimeter in the same gyrus. Now, based on the positioning of this sulci, the inferior frontal gyrus divided into three parts. The part below the anterior horizontal ramus, this area is known as pars orbitalis. The part between anterior horizontal and anterior ascending ramus, that is this particular part, it is known as pars triangularis. And the region posterior to the anterior ascending ramus, this area is known as pars opercularis. Thereby, we are completing the major sulci and gyri on the frontal lobe of superior lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Now, we will move on to see the major sulci and gyri on the temporal lobe of cerebral hemisphere. This is the first sulcus, and just below that we have a parallel second sulcus in the temporal lobe. The upper one and the lower one are correspondingly termed as superior and inferior temporal sulci. By these sulci, the temporal lobe is divided into a superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri. In addition to these, the superior surface of the superior temporal gyrus presents two transverse temporal gyri. That is not visualized from this view unless we separate the lips of the lateral sulcus, posterior ramus of lateral sulcus over here. If you separate it, you will identify the transverse temporal gyri on the superior surface of superior temporal gyrus. Among these, the anterior transverse temporal gyrus is also called as Heschel's gyrus, which forms the primary auditory area of the cortex. Next will be the sulci and gyri of parietal lobe. This is the first one. This sulcus is known as post-central sulcus. It runs downwards and forwards a little behind and parallel to the central sulcus. The area between these two sulci is called the post-central gyrus. The rest of the parietal lobe is divided into two by this particular sulcus, which is known as, this sulcus is known as intraparietal sulcus, and by the intraparietal sulcus, this parietal lobe is further divided into two, an upper part and a lower part. The upper part is known as superior parietal lobule and the lower area is known as inferior parietal lobule. Now, in addition to this, the upturned posterior end of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus and the posterior ends of superior and inferior temporal sulci extends into the inferior parietal lobule to divide the inferior parietal lobule into three parts. The first part, which is around the upturned edge of posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, and this part is known as, I will write it over here, supramarginal gyrus. This area is the supramarginal gyrus. Now the next one, that is the part surrounding the superior temporal sulcus. It is known as angular gyrus. And the part surrounding the inferior temporal sulcus, that is this particular area, it is known as arcus temporo-occipitalis. Now finally, we will see the sulci and gyri of the occipital lobe. It possesses mainly three rather short sulci, that is the lateral, the transverse and the lunate sulcus. This sulcus is the lateral occipital sulcus. It runs horizontally and divides this occipital lobe into superior and inferior occipital gyri. Next one is, here it is, that is the lunate sulcus. It is a C-shaped sulcus with a forward convexity just in front of the occipital pole. Now, we can see a sulcus is extending into the concavity of the lunate sulcus. This is the tip of the calcarine sulcus. Sometimes it is referred to as post-calcarine sulcus. Now finally, the transverse occipital sulcus, it runs downwards into the uppermost part of the occipital lobe from the supramedial border of the hemisphere, a little behind the parieto-occipital sulcus. This is the parieto-occipital sulcus, and this sulcus here is the transverse occipital sulcus. And for completion's sake, the cortex surrounding the parieto-occipital sulcus, that is this particular area, this area, it is known as arcus parieto-occipitalis. It lies in both parietal and occipital lobes. We will move on to see the sulci and gyri on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Similar to the supralateral surface, we will draw the outline first. This is the outline of the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. In this medial surface, there is one most conspicuous feature, and that feature is the presence of corpus callosum, which is shown over here. The corpus callosum is a C-shaped thick bundle of commissural fibers, and it consists of a central part which is known as trunk, a thick posterior part which is known as splenium, and curved anterior end over here which is known as the genum. The continuation over here is known as rostrum. Close to the rostrum, or in continuation with the rostrum, we have another structure which is known as, around this area, that structure is known as lamina terminalis. The sulci and gyri on the medial surface of cerebral hemisphere are located above, in front and behind the corpus callosum. We will see one by one. Before that, for completion's sake, we need to identify the extension of central sulcus onto the medial surface. We have already identified the central sulcus is mainly lying on the supralateral surface. Now you can see the extent of the central sulcus into the medial surface. This is it. This is that particular extent of the central sulcus into the medial surface. Now we will see the major sulci and gyri present on the medial surface one by one. The first one is the cingulate sulcus. The cingulate sulcus, it is one of the most prominent sulcus on the medial surface, and it follows a curved course about 1 centimeter above and parallel to the upper convex margin of corpus callosum. We can see the relation of the cingulate sulcus with the corpus callosum very clearly over here. Anteriorly, It ends below the genu of the corpus callosum. This is the genu of the corpus callosum. We can see the anterior end of the cingulate sulcus. Posteriorly, this particular sulcus turns upwards to reach the supramedial border of the cerebral hemisphere, a little behind the upper end of central sulcus. You can see the relationship of posterior end of cingulate sulcus from the central sulcus over here. The area between the cingulate sulcus and the corpus callosum is termed as, that is this particular area. Actually, it extends a little bit posteriorly also. This area is known as cingulate gyrus. Just in front of the lamina terminalis, we have two sulci, that is around this area we have two sulci, one in front and one behind. They are known as anterior and posterior paraolfactory sulci. And based on this sulci, there are two gyrus present over here. They are the paraterminal and paraolfactory gyri. The next sulcus is here in this area, and that sulcus is known as callosal sulcus. This callosal sulcus separates the cingulate gyrus from the corpus callosum. Now, the part of the medial surface of cerebral hemisphere between cingulate sulcus and the supramedial border of the hemisphere is divided by a short offshoot sulcus, that is this one, and it ascends from the cingulate sulcus above the middle of the trunk of corpus callosum. And by this offshoot, this medial surface in front of the cingulate sulcus is divided into two. One over here, one area over here, the other area over here. This much area. The first area is known as, that is this particular area is known as paracentral lobule, and the larger anterior area is known as medial frontal gyrus. The boundaries of paracentral lobule needs to be elaborated because it is the highest or cortical center of micturition and defecation. We are going to talk about this particular area. This is the area of paracentral lobule. It is bounded above by the supramedial border of the cerebral hemisphere. It is bounded below by the cingulate sulcus. Posteriorly, it is bounded by the upturned posterior end of the cingulate sulcus. And anteriorly, it is bounded by the offshoot sulcus from the cingulate sulcus. This paracentral lobule is invaded by the downturned upper end of the central sulcus, which you can see over here. The posterior part of medial surface behind the paracentral lobule has two main sulci. One is the calcarine sulcus, the next one is the parieto-occipital sulcus. We will see some details regarding the calcarine sulcus. Calcarine sulcus, that is this particular sulcus, it is mainly present on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It begins as a deep fissure little below the thick posterior end of the corpus callosum, which is known as the splenium, and it follows an arched course with convexity upwards, and this entire sulcus is directed towards the occipital pole and may extend slightly onto the superolateral surface. We have already seen that extension into the superolateral surface in the previous slide, previous diagram. The next sulcus is the parieto-occipital sulcus. This is the parieto-occipital sulcus. It is also present mainly on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It begins at the midpoint of the calcarine sulcus around this area and courses upwards and slightly backwards to cut the superomedial border of the cerebral hemisphere about 5 centimeter in front of the occipital pole, and it may extend slightly onto the superolateral surface. We have identified that also, and that extension was actually helping us to divide the superolateral surface of cerebral hemisphere into parietal lobe and occipital lobe. It helped us to draw an imaginary line, the first imaginary line, if you remember correctly. The triangular area between the posterior part of calcarine sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus over here, this area, it is known as cuneus. The quadrangular area between the parieto-occipital sulcus and paracentral lobule over here, it is known as precuneus. A small sulcus little above and parallel to the splenium is called a suprasplenial sulcus. This is that particular suprasplenial sulcus. It separates the precuneus from the cingulate gyrus. In some textbooks, the calcarine sulcus is divided by this particular point. Till this much area, it is known as the calcarine sulcus, and after that particular point where the parieto-occipital sulcus starts, it is known as post-calcarine sulcus. So don't get confused with the terminology. We have not shown any sulci and gyri present over here, which is actually the inferior surface. So this diagram is actually a view infromedially, so that we can see part of the inferior surface also. But we have not shown any sulci and gyri because we need to avoid confusion regarding the sulci and gyri. So we will focus only on the sulci and gyri of medial surface in this particular view. We will move on to see the sulci and gyri of inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. We already know the inferior surface is divided into two by this particular sulcus, that is the stem of the lateral sulcus, into an anterior part. This is the orbital part, and posteriorly this much area is known as the tendorial part. We will see some details of the stem of the lateral sulcus here itself. The stem of the lateral sulcus, it starts or begins as a deep cleft on the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere at the anterior perforated substance. You can identify the anterior perforated substance over here. The sulcus starts from this particular area. It extends laterally between the temporal pole. You can see the temporal pole. It extends laterally between the temporal pole and the posterior part of the orbital surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And on reaching the superolateral surface over this particular point, this is the stem. On reaching this particular point, this point is known as a Sylvian point. It divides into three rami: anterior horizontal, anterior ascending, and posterior. Now we will start drawing the sulci and gyri of the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. But before drawing that, we need to have an orientation. For getting that orientation, we need to draw the interpedunclar fossa. So we will draw the interpedunclar fossa and its boundaries first. We have to show the section of midbrain, and we can identify the optic nerve, optic chiasma, and the optic tract in relation with the interpedunclar fossa. And you have to draw the major structures, the mammillary bodies and the infundibulum within the interpedunclar fossa. Now we have to show the outline of cerebral hemisphere when viewed from the inferior surface, inferior aspect. This is the outline. This inferior surface, as we already know, divided into an anterior part, anterior orbital part, and posterior tendorial part by the stem of the lateral sulcus. This is the stem of the lateral sulcus. Now we will see the sulci and gyri of orbital surface and tendorial surface separately. First we will see the orbital surface. The first sulcus that we are going to deal is the olfactory sulcus. We can see the olfactory sulcus there. This one. It is a straight sulcus which runs anteroposteriorly close to the medial border of the orbital surface. It is called olfactory sulcus because it lodges the olfactory bulb and olfactory tract. The area medial to the sulcus, this particular area, it is known as gyrus rectus. There is another major sulcus present over here, that is the orbital sulcus. It is an irregular H-shaped sulcus and it divides the orbital surface into anterior, posterior, medial and lateral orbital gyri. This is the anterior orbital gyrus, this is the posterior orbital gyrus, this is the medial orbital gyrus and this is the lateral orbital gyrus. Now we will move on to see the sulci on the tendorial surface or tendorial part of the inferior surface. Mainly there are two sulci, collateral sulci and occipitotemporal sulcus. First we will see the collateral sulcus. This is the collateral sulcus. The area or the gyrus medial to the collateral sulcus over here, it is known as parahippocampal gyrus. Anterior end of the parahippocampal gyrus, it hooks sharply backwards and it is limited laterally by a sulcus. That sulcus we will see later, and this is the anteriormost end, hooked end of the parahippocampal gyrus, and this area is known as uncus. This is the next major sulcus on this tendorial surface. This is known as occipitotemporal sulcus. The area between the occipitotemporal sulcus laterally and collateral sulcus medially is known as this area. This area is known as medial occipitotemporal gyrus. The area lateral to the occipitotemporal sulcus is termed, that is this area, it is known as lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. This gyrus is continuous around the inferolateral margin of the hemisphere with the, that is around here, it is actually continuous with the inferior temporal gyrus. Now we can see the calcarine sulcus, part of the calcarine sulcus on the, these two are parts of the calcarine sulcus on the inferior aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. As we can clearly identify, the posteriormost aspect of the collateral sulcus is parallel to the calcarine sulcus. The area between the collateral sulcus and calcarine sulcus in this surface is known as, that is this area, it is known as lingual gyrus. Anteriorly, the lingual gyrus is continuous with the parahippocampal gyrus. Now we can see the anteriormost end of the parahippocampal gyrus, that is the uncus, and the uncus is limited laterally by this particular short sulcus, and this sulcus is known as rhinal sulcus. And for completion's sake, we can identify the extent of lunate sulcus into this particular surface. It is not always present in all the persons. So this was in general regarding the sulci and gyri on the various surfaces of the cerebral hemisphere. Thank you for your patient listening.